Have you ever wondered what love truly is, beyond the words we speak, beyond the feelings that rise and fade like waves upon the shore? Have you ever longed for a love that does not change, that does not end, that holds steady when all else falls away? Tonight, we'll rest in one of the most beautiful passages ever written, a letter from the Apostle Paul to the people of Corinth, a message not of instruction alone, but of tenderness, of clarity, of divine truth, about the way of love. 1 Corinthians 13, the chapter often called the heartbeat of Scripture, where love is not described as a fleeting emotion, but as a way of life, a reflection of God Himself. This love is patient, it is kind, it keeps no record of wrongs, it rejoices in truth, it bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, and never fails. Before we begin tonight's reflection, if these stories bring you peace, take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more nightly readings of Scripture, and share where you're listening from tonight. Your presence here keeps this gentle space alive, a circle of peace, growing with every heart that joins in. Now, take a slow breath. Let your shoulders fall, let your thoughts soften, and let the quiet of this moment draw you in. Tonight, you'll walk with those first believers of Corinth, a city alive with noise and ambition, and you'll hear the words that Paul sent to them, words meant to quiet division, and to remind every soul what truly matters. The world they lived in was full of striving, full of pride in speech and knowledge, but Paul's letter came like a calm wind after a storm, teaching them, and teaching us still, that all the gifts and all the wisdom in the world mean nothing without love. So rest now. As we begin our journey through the way of love, take one more deep breath and listen with your heart, for in the stillness, love is near. The city of Corinth stirred beneath the morning sun, its marble streets glowing with light, the air filled with the scent of spice and sea. Merchants called to passers-by, sails rippled in the harbor breeze, and from every corner came the hum of life and ambition, voices layered upon voices. It was a city of trade and learning, of temples and markets, of wealth and want, a place where cultures met and pride often grew in the space between them. The church there was young, full of passion, full of gifts, yet torn by quiet divisions, each heart certain of its own way, each voice eager to be heard above another. And far away, in another land, the Apostle Paul sat quietly at his table, his hands worn from years of travel and toil, his heart full of the people he had once walked beside. He had preached to them, wept with them, broken bread in their homes, and now, from afar, he wrote to them once more. He knew their strengths, their wisdom, their eloquence, their gifts of prophecy and faith. But he also knew how easily pride could steal the gentleness from truth, how easily knowledge could forget kindness, how easily faith could move mountains, yet leave the heart unmoved by love. So he began to write, slowly, thoughtfully, words that would one day echo through generations, words that spoke not to the mind alone, but to the soul. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am only a sounding gong or a clanging cymbal. The words flowed like quiet water, simple, yet full of weight. They fell upon the page not as correction, but as a call to remember what it means to live in God's rhythm. Paul paused for a moment, gazing through the window toward the dim horizon. His quill rested in his hand. His thoughts turned to the faces of those he missed. Lydia, Crispus, Phoebe, Aquila and Priscilla. He knew their hearts longed for truth. And so he wrote not as a teacher above them, but as a brother beside them. He wrote of gifts and miracles, of faith strong enough to move mountains, of generosity that gave all possessions away. And then he wrote the words that softened his own heart even as he wrote them. But if I have not love, I am nothing. He breathed deeply after the line, the truth of it filling the room like a sigh of heaven. For Paul knew that love was not an ornament added to faith, it was its very breath. far away in Corinth. Those who gathered to hear the letter read aloud would one day fall silent as the words reached their ears. The noise of their disputes would fade, the pride of their wisdom would quiet, and something sacred would stir in their hearts. Love, the kind that asks for nothing in return, the kind that listens more than it speaks, the kind that endures when everything else breaks. Paul's letter would remind them that all their knowledge, all their prophecy, all their tongues and triumphs would fade like dust in the wind, but love would remain in the quiet of his small room. Paul looked down at the parchment and smiled faintly. The candle beside him flickered, the light catching his eyes, and he whispered softly to himself, "This is the way of love." He dipped his quill once more, and continued to write, his hand steady, his heart full, as if guided by the hand of the Spirit itself. And across the sea, the believers of Corinth went about their day unaware, yet their hearts would soon be touched by these words, words that would teach them what the noise of the world could never say, that love, not knowledge, not status, not strength, is what makes a soul truly alive. The sun rose higher over the city, its light spilling into every corner, and somewhere, beyond the sound of the crowd, a quiet wind moved through the streets, whispering softly, "Love never fails." The letter was carried across miles of sea and stone, from the quiet hand of Paul to the restless heart of Corinth. It arrived with the creak of wooden wheels and the dust of travel upon its edges. A messenger delivered it to the small gathering of believers, those who met in simple homes, who prayed in whispers, and sang in voices that trembled between hope and uncertainty. That evening, as lamps were lit and shadows began to stretch along the walls, the people gathered close. The smell of oil and bread filled the air. A hush settled as the elder unrolled the parchment and began to read. "If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am only a sounding gong or a clanging cymbal." The words echoed through the small room, and every sound after seemed to fade beneath their weight. One by one, the faces of those listening began to change. Some looked downward, remembering harsh words they had spoken in pride. Others folded their hands in quiet thought, realizing how often they had served for recognition rather than compassion. Paul's voice, carried now through the elder's trembling tone, continued, "If I have the gift of prophecy, and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing." The elder paused, his own eyes glistening in the lamplight, and for a long moment no one spoke. The silence was thick with realization. The believers who had once argued over whose spiritual gifts were greater, now saw that love was not one gift among many. It was the very heart of them all. Paul's words did not condemn, they invited. They called every listener to remember what they had once felt when they first believed. That unexplainable warmth that made strangers into brothers, and enemies into friends. A young woman sitting near the wall lifted her gaze. Her eyes were soft with tears. She had come from a family divided, father against son, sister against sister, and for months she had prayed for peace that never came. But as she heard those words, "If I have not love, I am nothing," something shifted inside her. Love was not a dream for those who deserved it. It was the power to heal what the world declared unhealable. The elder's voice grew quieter, slower, as though even he was caught in the sacredness of the moment. "If I give all I possess to the poor, and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing." The room fell still, only the sound of the lamps crackling could be heard, and within that stillness, something unseen moved through them all. It was not emotion, but presence, not a thought, but a knowing. They understood now that love was not measured by what one gave or how much one sacrificed. It was found in the intention behind every act, in the quiet patience that expected nothing in return. Outside, the night had deepened. The stars spread wide across the sky, and beneath their light, the believers of Corinth sat in silence, letting the words sink deep into the soil of their souls. Paul's letter continued to rest upon the elder's lap, but his hands had stopped turning the scroll. The spirit of the words had already done its work for the night. One by one, the people rose. Each touched the parchment as they passed, not as ritual, but as reverence, as though touching the edge of something eternal. When they stepped outside, the streets of Corinth were still alive with noise, merchants closing shops, laughter spilling from taverns, voices calling across the square. Yet to those who had listened, the city felt quieter somehow. They walked home slowly through the lamplight, hearts gentler than before, eyes softer, thoughts clearer, and above them, the stars seemed to whisper in unison with the sea beyond the walls. Without love, nothing endures, but with love, everything begins again. The next evening settled over Corinth like a slow breath. Lamps bloomed in doorways, voices softened along the streets, and the sea sent a hush of wind through the alleys that smelled of figs and stone. In a small courtyard behind a weaver's house, the believers gathered again. They brought bread and dates and a jar of oil, and set them upon a low table made smooth by many meals and many prayers. No one hurried. They came with the patience of pilgrims, hearts opened by last night's reading, hands gentler than before. When all were seated, the elder unrolled the parchment once more. The lamplight trembled across the ink, and the words returned like a river that knew its way. Love is patient, love is kind. He paused there, as if the spirit itself had taken his breath, and the quiet lengthened into something holy. The sentence did not need to be long, to be eternal, in those few words. The life of God was described in the simplest of human terms: patient, kind, not hurried, not harsh, the sort of love that bends to wash a tired traveler's feet, and waits while wounds learn to heal. A young mother sat near the doorway, her baby asleep against her shoulder. She closed her eyes and saw the face of a neighbor who had spoken sharply to her at the well. She had wanted to answer quickly, to defend her name, but the words on the parchment held her hand. Love is patient. She felt the call to wait, to let time cool the ember of offense, to answer another day with gentleness. In the cradle of that resolve, the child upon her chest breathed deeper, as if peace had found room enough for two. Across the circle, an older man named Diodoros shifted upon his stool. He had been a merchant in the harbor, a man quick with numbers and quicker with judgments. He had come to faith late, bringing with him habits that clung like salt to a sailor's cloak. The line reached him where pride could not hide. Love is kind. He thought of a boy who swept the stalls at market, the one he often ignored. Tomorrow he would bring the boy warm bread, call him by his name, and ask about his mother. Kindness would be his first trade of the day, and whatever coin it returned, heaven would count it as wealth. The elder read on, "It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud." The people glanced at one another, remembering the comparisons that had slipped into their speech, the tallying of whose gift was brighter, whose words sounded wiser. One man who often prayed loudly lowered his head until his forehead touched the back of his clasped hands. He had measured his worth by how many eyes turned when he spoke. Now, he saw a better measure, the unseen good his silence could shelter, the way love makes room for another voice to rise. Love does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. The air itself seemed to listen, as if the night would carry these lines through the shutters of every house that needed them. A woman named Thais remembered a debt owed to her by a sister in the faith, a debt paid late, then paid again in excuses. Her ledger had grown heavy with memory, yet while the elder read, the ink of resentment ran like water in her mind. She pictured the parchment of her heart wiped clean, and saw her sister's face without the stain of yesterday. The freedom of it startled her. Forgiveness, she realized, is not the erasing of truth, but the choosing of love to be true still. The parchment breathed on, "Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. A quiet murmur of assent moved through the gathering, the soft sound of souls agreeing with heaven. Truth, they understood now, was not a weapon to win an argument, but light to reveal the way home. To rejoice with the truth was to dance with light, even when it shone upon one's own faults, for only what is revealed can be healed. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. The elder's voice fell to a whisper, and then to silence. The words continued without sound, moving from ear to heart, from heart to habit, as if they had been written upon the air itself. Protect, trust, hope, persevere, for pillars to hold a city of souls upright when the winds rise, for stones that mark the borders of love's country so that no traveler is lost upon its roads. A boy near the back, not yet grown tall enough to see over the shoulders before him, leaned against his father's arm. He remembered how another child had mocked his stutter by the docks. He had stored the hurt like a small stone in his pocket, turning it over again and again. Tonight he reached into that pocket in his mind, and set the stone down upon the ground. Love always hopes, he whispered to himself, and hope cannot carry stones that make the road hard. Around the table, bread was broken, oil poured, dates shared. No one took the larger piece. No one spoke above a whisper. The meal itself became a sermon written in crumbs and fingerprints, a liturgy of ordinary kindness. The mother who had chosen patience handed food first to the neighbor who had wounded her. The loud praying man listened while a quiet widow told a story of God's provision in small things. Diodoros, the merchant, asked the elder if the gathering could set aside coins for the boy at market, not as charity alone, but as a hallway into belonging. When the meal was finished, the elder did not roll the parchment away. He left it open upon the table, and the lines seemed to glow, as if the oil within the lamp had reached the ink. Love never fails, he read at last. Almost no sound followed, for failure was a companion they all knew too well. They had watched promises fail, crops fail, bodies fail, courage fail, but this, Paul dared to write, never fails. Love, the life of God laid upon human hearts, the one thing that does not bow to time, nor break beneath sorrow, nor end at the edge of the grave. The elder lifted his eyes. Brothers and sisters, if love never fails, then let us leave no room for anything that does. No applause rose, only the slow rustle of people standing with a new carefulness, as though the ground beneath them had become sacred. They embraced without hurry, they blessed one another without pretense, and when they left, the city's noise met them, but could not enter them. On the road home, the moon hung over the harbor like a silver seal upon dark water. Thais walked beside the sister she had forgiven, and found that conversation tasted sweeter without the grit of old grievances. The boy with the stutter counted stars with his father, discovering that numbers could be a hymn. Diodoros passed the stall of a sleeping sweeper, and placed a loaf of bread where the boy would find it at dawn. In many houses, husbands softened their tone. Wives held back the needed correction one heartbeat longer. Children fetched water before being asked. The city did not know that a chapter had been read, but the city felt that something gentle had passed by its doors. In the quiet room behind the weaver's house, the elder remained, alone with the parchment. He traced the final line with his fingertip, and prayed the simplest prayer a shepherd can offer. Lord, let love be the air they breathe, the road they walk, the home they return to. He blew out the lamp, and the stars finished the reading upon the sky. And in the hush that followed, the Spirit wrote what ink could not, into the living pages of their days, a slow and certain script of patience and kindness, of protection and hope, of the kind of perseverance that looks like a mother waiting at a window, a father blessing with open hands, a friend carrying another's sorrow as if it were not heavy at all. Somewhere far away, Paul lifted his face toward the same moon, and though he could not see Corinth, he smiled, for he knew that love, once spoken with faith, travels farther than letters, and builds cathedrals inside of people, where God is worshipped in ordinary acts that angels recognize as holy. The sea breathed in and out along the shore, Corinth slept, heaven kept watch, and the words remained, not as law to be enforced, but as life to be received, patient, kind, enduring, eternal. The morning unfolded over Corinth like a slow awakening, light seeping between rooftops and pillars, the streets beginning to hum with the sound of footsteps and trade. The city was alive again, yet within a few quiet homes, something had changed, unseen but real, like the scent of rain that lingers long after the storm has passed. Among those homes was the small dwelling of the woman named Thais. She woke before the others, her eyes opening to the faint glow of dawn spilling through the window. The air was cool, the city still half asleep, and for a moment she simply breathed, letting the stillness settle over her like a shawl of peace. She turned her thoughts toward the letter, still fresh in her mind from the night before. The words of Paul seemed to whisper through the quiet of the room. Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it keeps no record of wrongs. Each phrase had carved a new rhythm into her heart, a slower, gentler rhythm. She rose quietly, wrapped her cloak around her shoulders, and stepped into the courtyard where morning light touched the fig leaves. She knelt by the small basin of water kept for washing, and as she cupped her hands to her face, she whispered softly, "Let my heart be clean again today, washed in patience, in kindness, in love." She looked upward, and for the first time in many months, she felt no weight pressing behind her ribs, only space, wide and quiet. A few streets away, Diodoros prepared his cart for the market. He loaded rolls of cloth one by one, each carefully folded, each chosen with care. His hands were slower than they once were, less driven by profit, more mindful of purpose, for he had come to understand that love was not in the selling, but in the way one treated those who came to buy. He had once believed that generosity meant giving away what you could spare, but now he understood it differently. True generosity, he realized, meant giving without the shadow of self in it, giving even when no one noticed. As he tied the last bundle onto his cart, the young sweeper approached, the boy with tired eyes and rough hands. Diodoros smiled and handed him a piece of bread and a small flask of water. The boy looked surprised, then shyly whispered, "Thank you, sir." Diodoros placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "You need not call me sir," he said softly. "We are brothers in this city, and brothers break bread together." The boy smiled, the kind of smile that does not come easily to one who has known little kindness. He took the bread and ran off down the lane, a spark of light following his steps. As Diodoros watched him go, he realized that love had no need for words of recognition. It simply gave, and vanished into joy. Later that day, the believers gathered again in the courtyard behind the weaver's house. The air shimmered with sunlight filtering through olive branches, and a soft breeze carried the smell of warm bread from nearby homes. They did not meet out of duty. They met because something sacred had begun to grow between them, a kind of unseen thread binding soul to soul. Each had been changed by the letter, not by command, but by invitation. When all had gathered, the elder unrolled the parchment once more. His voice trembled slightly as he read the next lines. "Love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away." He paused, letting the words breathe, letting their simplicity sink deeper than thought. "For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when completeness comes, what is in part disappears." The listeners sat motionless. Each felt the truth of it, that every human thing, even the brightest gift, was only a fragment of something far greater. Only love, the fullness of God's own heart, would remain unbroken. A quiet wind moved through the courtyard, rustling the branches overhead. The elder looked upward and smiled faintly. "We see only a reflection now," he said softly, as though looking into a dim mirror. "But one day, we will see face to face." Thais closed her eyes at those words, and saw in her mind's eye a mirror not of glass, but of water. Its surface stirred with her own reflection, yet deeper still she glimpsed another face, gentler, infinite, the face of love itself. A young man named Aretas leaned forward, his voice almost a whisper. "So even our clearest understanding is only the shadow of what's to come." The elder nodded slowly. "Yes, the greatest truth we can grasp now is the smallest part of eternity, and that part is love." The group sat in silence once again, and the quiet was not heavy, it was luminous. The sunlight shimmered upon the table where the parchment lay, and for a long moment, it seemed as if heaven itself was reading with them. When the silence finally broke, Lydia, the woman who had first opened her home for gatherings, spoke softly. "Love never fails," she said, "even when we do." The words rippled gently through the group, echoing what every heart already knew. Love was the breath that carried them when words were gone. Love was the bridge between what they understood and what they could only hope for. Love was the light that turned imperfection into beauty. The elder closed the scroll carefully and placed his hand over it. "Then let us love one another, not because it is commanded, but because it is who God is within us." They rose slowly, lingering in the stillness that followed. Some embraced quietly, some prayed in silence, some simply stood beneath the olive tree and let the wind move through their hair. The meeting ended not with speeches, but with peace. Each person leaving carried a piece of that peace within them, unseen, yet shining in their steps. Thais walked home through the narrow lanes, the setting sun casting long shadows before her. She felt no need to speak, no need to prove, no need to be seen. Her heart was full in its simplicity. When she reached her door, she paused and looked back toward the hills glowing with dusk. The wind brushed her face, and she whispered, "Lord, let my life be love, even in silence." And as the first stars appeared above the city, she entered her home quietly, her lamp glowing warm against the walls, and in that gentle light, her heart rested, knowing that the way of love, once found, never truly ends. The night drew a silver veil over Corinth, and the world seemed to rest beneath its quiet weight. The streets were calm, the air cool and soft. Only the distant hum of the sea reminded the city that the earth still breathed beneath the stars. Inside her small home, Thais sat by the lamp, the light trembling upon the parchment she kept folded near her bed. It was not her own copy of Paul's letter, there was only one in the city, but she had written a few lines from memory upon a scrap of cloth. Her hand had traced them carefully earlier that evening, and now she read them again, slowly. "Love is patient, love is kind, it keeps no record of wrongs, it rejoices with the truth, it always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres, love never fails." She whispered each phrase aloud, and as she spoke, her heart began to calm further, her body loosening into the stillness of night. It was not simply the comfort of the words that soothed her, it was the sense that they were alive, as if she were not just reading them, but being read by them. She thought of the people in her life, faces both kind and cold, the merchant who once overcharged her at the market, the friend who had not returned a borrowed garment, the neighbor whose laughter sometimes sounded like scorn. Each face rose in her mind, and with each one, she breathed out a prayer. Love is patient, love is kind. The small room grew warm with quiet grace. Meanwhile, across the city, Diodoro sat in his workshop near the harbor. The day's trade was done, the stalls closed, and the smell of salt and oil filled the air. He was mending a torn length of sailcloth, his hands moving with slow precision. He hummed softly to himself, a tune his mother had sung when he was a boy. He did not realize at first that the tune had changed, that it had begun to follow the rhythm of the words he had heard the night before. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. The thread slipped through the cloth, looping gently like time itself, and Diodoro smiled. For the first time in many years, the sound of the sea did not make him think of what he lacked, but of how small worries are when measured against eternity. He leaned back for a moment, his eyes on the dim horizon. The moon shimmered on the water like a promise that refused to fade. He spoke softly into the stillness. Love never fails, not even here, not even in me. Farther inland, in the home of Lydia, the woman whose courtyard held their gatherings, a small flame burned low beside her bed. She was writing by lamplight. Though her eyes were tired, she wrote not for herself, but for the children she taught, the little ones who would one day learn to read. Upon a sheet of rough parchment she carefully formed the words of Paul's letter, line by line. Her hand moved slowly, reverently. She paused at one verse and whispered it aloud. When I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. Her voice wavered slightly. She remembered her own childhood, the hunger, the fear, the moments of loneliness before she found faith, and she thought how even as adults, they all carried pieces of that child still, frightened, defensive, yearning to be loved. But Paul's words reminded her that love, when it is trusted, grows the soul. It does not erase the child, but heals it, and leads it by the hand into maturity. She smiled gently as she wrote, Now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know, in part, but then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. She laid her pen down and rested her palm upon the page, letting the warmth of her hand blend with the warmth of the words. To be fully known, she thought, and still fully loved. There could be no greater peace than this. The lamp flickered and grew dim, and Lydia lifted her eyes toward the stars visible through the window. She whispered softly, Love knows me even when I do not understand myself. The words floated upward into the stillness, carried by the night wind like a prayer, across the city. The believers who had gathered around that single letter all rested beneath the same sky, their homes scattered through Corinth like small lights in a sea of shadow. Yet within each home, the same quiet truth now lived, the same presence that had turned words into life. Love had begun to take root. It was not loud, not showy, not a burst of emotion. It was steady, constant, the slow growth of peace in places where conflict once lived. The mother who had been quick to anger now waited before speaking. The man who had once judged quickly now listened longer. The widow who had hidden from neighbors now shared her meal with the poor. The city did not know that love was blooming in its streets, but heaven saw it and smiled. That night, as the last lamps went out, a hush fell over Corinth, and the faint sound of the sea could be heard in the distance, a rhythm steady and unchanging, like the heartbeat of the world. And within that rhythm, something eternal whispered through every sleeping home. Love never fails. It does not end when words grow quiet. It does not fade when days turn dark. It remains, living where faith is born, flowing through every act of kindness, and resting upon those who trust its source. The stars above Corinth shimmered brighter that night, and the city, tired, flawed, human, slept beneath the watch of love that had no end. The dawn returned softly over Corinth, a slow unfurling of gold across the roofs and harbor. The world stirred again beneath its gentle glow, yet the hearts of those who had listened to Paul's letter were still anchored in a deeper calm, one that morning could not disturb. Thais woke to the sound of her daughter's laughter, a melody that carried through the small home like sunlight itself. She smiled as she rose from her bed. her body weary from the week's labor, yet her spirit light. The scent of bread, baking drifted from the courtyard oven. Her neighbor, the same one who had once spoken harshly to her at the well, had begun to share her fire each morning. Ties paused at the doorway, watching the woman's figure move quietly through the haze of rising smoke, and something in her heart softened even more. Yesterday she might have passed in silence. Today she stepped forward and spoke with a voice as warm as the morning light. "Peace to you, sister." The woman looked up, surprised, then smiled faintly. "And to you," she said. The moment was brief, but it glowed like the lighting of a lamp between two hands. Ties turned back to her own hearth and thought to herself, love does not keep score of old words. It begins again, every dawn, across the city. Diodoros pushed his cart through the market square. The noise of traders filled the air, the rise and fall of bargaining voices, the clatter of jars and coins, the rhythm of 100 human needs woven together. Yet beneath the chaos, he heard something else, something softer, a kind of harmony between the sounds, a reminder that even noise could not silence peace. He greeted each face with kindness, remembering the words, "Love is patient, love is kind, it is not proud, it does not seek its own." Once, he would have hurried through each sale. Now, he looked each customer in the eye, truly seeing them, not as coin bearers, but as souls carrying unseen burdens. When one man grew angry at a price, Diodoros only smiled and said, "Take what you need, pay what you can." The man blinked in disbelief, then nodded, speechless. The transaction ended not with profit, but with gratitude, and Diodoros felt richer for it. Later that day, as the sun climbed high over the marble roofs, the believers gathered again by the riverbank, not because they had been told to, but because love itself drew them there. The water glimmered in the light, moving endlessly toward the sea, like time itself, flowing, gentle, unstoppable. Lydia stood among them, her eyes full of quiet joy. The parchment rested in her hands once more, though she did not read aloud this time. The words had already been spoken enough, now they simply lived between them. The group stood together in silence for a long time, listening to the sound of the river and the wind through the reeds. Then the elder, his voice low and tender, said softly, "Love bears all things." He paused, letting the words sink in. "It bears when others misunderstand you, when they speak against you, when life grows heavy with burdens unseen." His eyes lifted toward the horizon. "And when love bears, it does not break, it becomes stronger, gentler, wiser." Aretas, the young man who once struggled with anger, nodded slowly. "I think I begin to see," he said softly. "Love carries the weight we cannot carry alone." The elder smiled. "Yes, and when we carry one another's burdens, we walk as Christ walked, for he bore all things, and still, he loved." The air grew still around them. The river's murmur filled the silence, and for a long while, no one spoke. Then Lydia knelt by the water's edge, cupping it in her hands, letting it run through her fingers like liquid light. "This water never stops flowing," she said quietly. "Even when we are gone, it continues on. So too with love, it flows from one heart into another, until even those who never met Paul will know these words to be true." The elder nodded. "Love never fails, because it never ends." A soft wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of fig blossoms and distant rain, and it felt, to those gathered, as though heaven itself had drawn near. Ties closed her eyes and prayed silently. "Lord, let me love with your endurance, even when I am weary, even when kindness is not returned, let love still rise within me." Her daughter sat beside her, tracing circles in the dirt with her small finger, and whispered, "Mama, what does love look like?" Ties smiled and lifted her into her lap. "It looks like this," she said gently. "Like holding someone close even when the day is long, like forgiving before the apology comes, like trusting that God's heart is bigger than our fear." The child smiled sleepily. "Then I will love like that too." The others nearby heard and smiled, for in her innocent words, they heard the echo of everything Paul had written. As the sun began to set behind the hills, the believers slowly rose, their faces touched by the gold of evening light. Each one carried something unseen from that place, a stillness deeper than silence, a warmth that no fire could give. They returned to their homes, to their work, to their families, but love walked beside them like an unseen companion. And as night fell once again over Corinth, the city seemed quieter than before, not because it made less noise, but because within it, there were now hearts that listened differently. In the courtyard where they had gathered, the last light shimmered upon the water, and the ripples glowed faintly under the moon. A whisper rose from the elder's lips before he departed. "The way of love is not a road to walk once, it is the ground beneath every step." He turned toward home, his shadow long upon the earth, and above him, the first stars appeared, silent witnesses to a truth older than time itself. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, and never fails. And beneath those stars, Corinth slept, while the eternal love of God, the same love that once spoke creation into being, kept watch over every soul that dared to trust its light. The morning rose with a hush of silver light over the hills of Corinth. The sea in the distance shimmered like glass, and the first calls of merchants drifted softly through the waking streets. The world moved again, yet somewhere beneath the rhythm of daily life, love continued its quiet work, unseen, but steady. In the small courtyard behind the weaver's house, Lydia swept the stone floor, her movements slow and mindful. A fragment of Paul's words played in her mind like a refrain she could not forget. "When I was a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things." She paused for a moment, resting on her broom. Her thoughts turned to the people she had known before Christ, the old habits of pride and haste that once guided her, the many ways she had sought to be right rather than to be kind. Now, those ways no longer fit her heart. Like clothes grown too small, she looked up at the olive tree that shaded the courtyard. Its leaves trembled softly in the breeze, and she thought, perhaps love is like this tree, slow to grow, but once rooted, it does not bend to every wind. Across the city, Diodoros walked along the harbor path, his sandals brushing against the worn stones. The morning light caught the ripples of the water, and he stopped for a moment to watch the fishermen at work. Their nets moved in rhythm, rising and falling together, each man dependent on the other, none stronger, none lesser. He smiled quietly, remembering how Paul had written of the body of Christ. Many parts, but one whole. He realized then that love was the thread that bound those parts together. Without it, even the strongest net would break. He walked on, passing a group of young men arguing over prices at the market, their voices sharp, eyes fierce with competition. Diodoros stopped beside them and said nothing, only placed a hand on one man's shoulder and smiled. The others fell silent. The air shifted slightly, the edge of tension dulled, and in that small silence, peace returned. He walked away without a word, leaving behind only calm. He thought to himself, perhaps love speaks loudest when it says nothing at all. Meanwhile, Thais carried a small basket of figs to the home of her neighbor, the same woman who had once spoken harshly to her. The woman opened the door hesitantly, her eyes surprised but soft. "These are from my tree," Thais said gently. "The sweetest ripened this morning, and I thought of you." The neighbor took the basket slowly, her voice trembling. "I was unkind to you. I should not have been." Thais smiled. "The words have already gone with the wind," she whispered. Let us begin again." The woman blinked back tears. "Then let this be the first day of peace between us." They stood there for a moment, two hearts once divided, now joined by a simple act of love that asked for nothing but to be true. That afternoon, the believers met again by the river. The sun shimmered upon the surface, and the air smelled of earth and light. Children played nearby, their laughter mingling with the rustle of reeds. The elder stood before them with the parchment open once more, though by now they all knew the words by heart. His voice was low, like a father speaking to his children before sleep. "When I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things." He looked at them one by one, faces he had watched grow from fear into faith, from confusion into calm. "Brothers and sisters," he said softly, "there is a time for learning, and there is a time for becoming. Love teaches us both. It teaches by patience, and it matures by mercy." He walked slowly along the water's edge as he spoke. The believers followed his words like a gentle current carrying them downstream. When we were young in faith, we thought of God as far away, high above the clouds. But now, we begin to see him here, in the laughter of children, in the bread we share, in the forgiveness that flows between us. He stopped and looked at his reflection in the water. "We still see dimly, but one day, we shall see clearly. For now, we know only in part, but even in our fragments, God's love holds us whole." Lydia closed her eyes, letting the wind brush against her face. She felt those words settle into her soul like warm light through glass. She whispered quietly, "To be known by God, even in my incompleteness, and still loved fully, that is enough." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group, and for a long while, no one spoke. The river moved gently before them, reflecting the light of the sun in small flashes, like liquid fire. Each shimmer felt like a heartbeat of heaven, a reminder that love was not only divine, but alive. The elder lifted his gaze toward the hills beyond the city, where the horizon faded into gold, and said softly, "The world seeks power, and strength, and wisdom, but we will seek love, for love alone will outlast all else." Thais opened her eyes and saw her daughter chasing a butterfly nearby, laughing as it danced just beyond reach. She smiled faintly, and thought, "Love is like that too, always near, always drawing us onward, but never captured, for it is endless, eternal, alive." The elder's final words drifted through the stillness. Faith will one day become sight, hope will one day be fulfilled, but love will remain, for love is the life of God itself. As the sun dipped lower, shadows lengthened over the water, and the believers bowed their heads in prayer. The sound of the river became their amen, steady, unbroken, when they rose to leave. The city's bells began to ring in the distance, calling others to the marketplace, to the noise of trade and toil. But for those who had gathered here, a different call filled their hearts, the call to live gently, to forgive quickly, to speak softly, to love without end. And as the evening wrapped the city in its quiet light, love flowed through Corinth like a silent river, unseen, yet everywhere. The day faded slowly into evening over Corinth. The sun sank behind the western hills, leaving the city bathed in a golden hush. The smell of the sea mingled with the warmth of dust and bread, and from the harbor came the faint cry of gulls returning to their nests. In the courtyard of Lydia's home, a small lamp flickered to life, its flame wavered gently, and gathered around it were familiar faces, men and women who had begun to live differently, quietly transformed by words that had not left their hearts since they were first spoken. Paul's letter had become more than parchment now. It was breath, memory, rhythm, a thread binding them all together in a harmony the world could not hear. but heaven surely could. Thais sat near the edge of the circle with her daughter sleeping against her lap. The child's hair glowed faintly in the lamplight, and Thais ran her fingers gently through it, remembering the question the little one had asked days before. "Mama, what does love look like?" She looked around now and saw the answer everywhere. Love was Lydia quietly filling a cup for a neighbor before pouring her own. Love was Diodoros helping the elder to his seat without being asked. Love was the widow Irene sharing her last loaf with a traveler she barely knew. No great signs, no miracles, no thunder or flame, only small, patient mercies, repeated until they became a way of life. The elder spoke softly into the gathering twilight. "Do you see how love has changed even our silence? Once, we waited for teaching. Now, we sit together in peace, and that peace itself speaks." He turned his gaze upward toward the first stars beginning to bloom above the courtyard wall. There is a kind of understanding that words can never teach, the kind that only love reveals. He paused, then continued. "Paul said, 'We see now in a mirror dimly.' But then, face to face, he was not only speaking of heaven, I think. He meant this too, that each act of love is like a clearer mirror. Each kindness wipes away another layer of dust, until one day we shall look upon the world and see the reflection of God shining through all things." The believers listened, breathing slowly, letting the stillness settle deep within them. Diodoros nodded quietly. "I used to think love was a reward, something to be earned by good deeds, but now I see, it is a gift, one that grows only when given away." Lydia smiled. "Yes, and each time we love, even in small ways, it becomes easier to see God's hand in the ordinary. I used to think faith meant climbing upward to reach Him. Now I know He meets us here, in bread, in work, in one another." The elder's eyes softened as he looked around the circle. "That is the mystery of it, my friends. Love makes the invisible visible." Outside the courtyard, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm: arguments, laughter, songs from taverns. Yet here, the air felt like still water. Time slowed. The moment seemed suspended between heaven and earth. Thais looked down at her daughter sleeping against her arm. The child's breathing was steady and peaceful, her small hand resting over her heart. She will grow up knowing peace, Thais thought. She will know love not by words, but by how it feels to be surrounded by it. She lifted her gaze to the group and whispered softly, almost to herself, "Love is the only sermon that never ends." The elder heard and smiled. "Yes," he said quietly. "Love is the one truth that echoes even after every voice grows silent." He looked at the parchment lying on the table, its edges worn from many hands, its ink fading slightly under the lamp's glow. "These words will one day fade," he said gently. "The paper will crumble, the ink will vanish, but what they awakened will not. For love does not fade. It only changes form, from words into lives, from letters into light." The flame of the lamp fluttered as a soft wind passed through the courtyard. The believers lifted their eyes to the sky, where the stars had multiplied, countless and clear. The elder raised his hand slightly. "Even the stars," he said, "burn and fade, but love, the love of God that lives in us, it is the one fire that never dies." They bowed their heads together, not in duty but in gratitude. And the elder prayed softly, his words barely louder than breath. "Lord, let love continue what we cannot. Let it speak when our words fail. Let it heal where our hands cannot reach. Let it be stronger than time and nearer than breath." A hush fell over them when he finished. The only sound was the small crackle of the lamp. The peace that followed was not empty. It was full, alive, thick with the presence of God. Slowly they rose to depart. One by one, they embraced, not formal, not polite, but with the kind of warmth that makes even silence holy. When Thais stepped into the street, the moonlight bathed the cobblestones in silver. The air was cool and clean. She carried her daughter close, her heart beating steady and slow. The city's noise returned in the distance, but it no longer felt like chaos. It was simply life, messy, fleeting, beloved. And within it all, love moved quietly, unseen but unshakable. As she walked home, she whispered to the sleeping child, "Love never fails, little one. Not when the world is kind, not when it is cruel. It endures all things. It always finds its way home." The moon shone high above Corinth, its light resting gently on every roof, every heart, every silent prayer. And somewhere beyond what eyes could see, love continued to move, the same love that formed the stars, that whispered through Paul's pen, that lived now in every breath of those who believed. A love that bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, a love that never fails. The night deepened slowly over Corinth, wrapping the city in velvet quiet. Lamps flickered in distant windows, their glow trembling against the stone walls of narrow streets. The sea whispered beyond the harbor, its slow rhythm mingling with the hum of crickets and the faint rustle of fig leaves in the breeze. In the home of Thais, the world had grown still. Her daughter slept soundly in the corner, her breathing steady as the tide, and Thais herself sat awake beside the small lamp on the table, its light soft upon her hands. She held no parchment, no scroll, only the memory of Paul's letter within her heart. It lived there now, word by word, like a prayer carved into her soul. She closed her eyes and whispered softly, "Love is patient, love is kind." Each pause between the words felt alive, like breathing with the heartbeat of God. Her mind wandered through the days behind her, the many moments when anger had tempted her tongue, when pride had whispered, "Defend yourself," when worry had pressed heavy upon her chest. But in each of those moments, love had reached quietly beneath the noise, not loud, not forceful, but present. It was love that kept her from speaking when silence would heal more deeply. Love that turned her hands toward generosity when fear told her to withhold. Love that taught her that the power of faith was not in miracles, but in mercy. She whispered again, "Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things." And then, with a trembling voice, she added, "Lord, teach me to live those words when the days grow hard." Across the city, the harbor lay quiet under the silver face of the moon. Diodoros walked slowly along the water's edge, his sandals leaving faint prints in the sand. He had closed his stall early that evening, choosing instead to listen to the sea. The waves moved like slow breath, forward and back, never hurried, never uncertain. He thought of Paul's words and smiled faintly. "We see in a mirror dimly," he whispered, but then face to face. He bent down and looked at his reflection in the rippling water. The image wavered, bent by the motion of the waves, yet he could still recognize himself. "So it is with us," he murmured. "Even when our view is imperfect, love recognizes us as its own." He straightened slowly, gazing at the horizon where sea met sky. There, he thought, beyond sight, was the one who loved them first, the one who saw clearly when they could not. He lifted his hand in the night air, whispering, "Thank you, Lord, for loving us not because we understand, but because you do." Meanwhile, Lydia sat within her quiet room, the same parchment folded before her on the table. The ink had faded slightly under many fingers, but its truth had not dimmed. She ran her hand over the lines as though feeling the pulse of the words beneath. For weeks now, she had hosted these gatherings, and each time, the letter had spoken something new, not because the words changed, but because love had changed the hearts that received them. Tonight, she prayed not for the strength to lead, but for the gentleness to listen. "Let love be my teacher," she whispered. "Let me not hurry the hearts of others into understanding, but walk with them as you have walked with me." She rose, moved to the window, and looked out over the sleeping city. The air shimmered faintly, touched by starlight. Somewhere far away, she imagined Paul, older now, perhaps still writing, perhaps still praying by a flickering flame in another small room. She smiled and whispered softly, "Your words live, Paul, not because they are yours, but because they belong to the one who is love itself." In another quarter of the city, the elder knelt upon the cool floor of his chamber. His hands rested open upon his knees, palms upward. He had seen much in his years: persecution, loss, the frailty of men and nations. Yet tonight, his heart was still. He prayed not for deliverance, not for revival, but for one thing only, that love would continue its quiet work long after he was gone. "Let them love one another," he prayed, "not as the world loves, but as you love, without end." Outside, the first hint of dawn began to pale the sky. The stars faded one by one, and the city sighed as it turned in its sleep. Thais rose from her chair and blew gently upon the lamp. The flame bowed once, then vanished, leaving behind a thin thread of smoke that curled upward like prayer. She looked toward her sleeping daughter and smiled. "The peace of love," she whispered, "is the rest of the soul." She lay beside her child, her hand resting gently over the little one's back, feeling the steady rhythm of her breath. The words of the letter flowed once more through her mind, but this time, they were no longer words at all, they were presence. They were peace. Love had become the air she breathed. In that moment, as the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Corinth slept beneath a grace that was deeper than understanding, the kind of peace that comes when love has taken root. The city would wake soon. Voices would rise. Markets would open. Ships would sail. But through it all, love would continue its quiet, eternal work, unseen, but holding every heart that dared to believe. For love never fails, it lives when all else fades, it binds what the world divides, it remains, as God remains. And so the night gave way to morning, and morning to promise, and the promise to love everlasting. The dawn rose gently over Corinth, painting the rooftops in a glow of pale gold. The air carried the scent of olives and sea salt, and the city began to stir once more from its quiet rest. Yet within a few hearts, those who had gathered by the river, those who had listened beneath the olive trees, those who had prayed in silence over Paul's words, there was a peace that did not wake with the noise of the world. It remained, still and sure, like calm water beneath a restless sky. Thais stepped outside. her home and watched the morning unfold. Her daughter still slept inside, and the faint sound of her soft breathing reached her like music from another world. She looked toward the distant hills, where the sun crept higher, and whispered, "Another day to love." She walked slowly to the well in the square. Her neighbor, the woman she had once quarreled with, was already there, drawing water with quiet strength. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither spoke. Then Ties smiled, and the woman returned it. The silence between them was no longer the weight of pride, but the space of peace. They filled their jars side by side, and when they were done, the woman said softly, "Your figs were sweet, Ties, sweeter than I remembered." Ties chuckled gently. Perhaps forgiveness ripens them better than sun. The woman laughed, a sound full of warmth, free of defense, and for that moment, love was alive in the simple act of laughter shared between two who once stood apart. Across the harbor, Diodoros stood before his stall, arranging the morning's goods with deliberate care. The market was alive again, noise, motion, color, but his heart moved slower than the crowd. He felt no rush to sell, no hurry to earn. The words of Paul had rooted themselves too deeply for that. A customer approached, a young man, nervous, counting his coins twice before speaking. Diodoros saw his worry before hearing his words. The boy's clothes were threadbare, his sandals frayed. He pointed to a roll of coarse linen and whispered, "For my mother, she is ill." Diodoros nodded, his face kind. "Take it," he said softly. "No coin needed. Love has already paid." The boy's eyes widened. He hesitated, then took the cloth with trembling hands. I will repay you." Diodoros smiled faintly. "Then repay me by loving someone else." The boy's lips parted, as though to protest, but he saw something in the merchant's eyes, a peace that could not be bought, and simply nodded. As the boy walked away, Diodoros looked toward the sky and whispered, "So this is how love multiplies, quietly, invisibly, like light through glass." Elsewhere in the city, Lydia stood in her workshop. The loom before her whispered with rhythm as threads passed through threads. She thought of Paul's words again. "Now we see through a mirror dimly, but then face to face." The weaving reminded her of that truth. Each thread alone seemed fragile, meaningless, yet together, they formed something beautiful. Love was like that, each act of kindness, each prayer, each forgiveness. A single strand that, when joined with others, became a tapestry strong enough to last beyond a lifetime. The elder visited her near midday. His steps were slower now, but his eyes were brighter than ever, like the flame of a lamp that burns pure, not fierce. He watched her weave for a while before speaking. "Your work reminds me of God's," he said gently. "He weaves our faults and our faith together until even our failings become part of the design." Lydia smiled. "Then perhaps love is the thread that keeps the pattern from falling apart." He nodded slowly. "Yes, and even when we cannot see the full design, love sees it all." The two stood in silence for a time, the sound of the loom filling the room like quiet song. The elder finally said, "There are days I wonder how long I will remain in this body, but I have no fear. For if love never fails, then death is only another form of meeting, the face of love revealed." Lydia's eyes softened. "Then when you see him face to face, tell him that we loved as best we could." The elder smiled faintly. "I believe he already knows." Outside, the sun began its descent, and Corinth once again shifted into the soft hues of evening. The believers gathered for prayer, fewer words now, fewer teachings, only stillness and gratitude. Thais held her daughter's hand as the child drowsed against her arm. The river beside them caught the last light of the day, gold fading into silver, and the reflection rippled softly beneath the wind. The elder lifted his voice for what might be the final time they would hear him speak these words, and now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. He looked upon them, his eyes glistening in the fading light. And the greatest of these is love. No one moved. No one spoke. The words hung in the air like incense, fragrant and eternal. The river murmured its amen. Thais felt tears slide down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were the overflow of peace, the kind that comes when one finally understands that love is not an idea, but a presence. Her daughter stirred and looked up. "Mama," she whispered sleepily, "what is love?" Thais smiled through her tears. "It's what makes us see God, even when our eyes are closed." The child nodded softly and fell asleep again, her head against her mother's shoulder. The elder raised his hands gently toward the river, the hills, the darkening sky. "Lord," he prayed, "may your love remain when our voices fall silent. May it guard this city, these hearts, these lives, until the day we see you clearly." The wind moved through the olive trees, rustling their leaves like quiet applause from heaven. And as the first star appeared above the water, the believers sat together in the twilight, no longer strangers, no longer divided, bound forever by the love that had found them, changed them, and promised never to let them go. Love that bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, and never fails. The last light of day drifted over Corinth like a slow exhale. The sky deepened into rose and amber, then softened into the blue of evening. A gentle breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the distant sound of waves against the shore and the low hum of the city settling into rest. Thais stood by her doorway, watching the horizon fade. The world felt slower now, as if time itself had learned patience. Beside her, her daughter played with a small piece of thread, tying it into loops and letting it fall apart again. The simple rhythm of her child's play reminded Thais of the loom in Lydia's workshop, how every loose strand could one day become part of something whole. She thought of the elder's words that afternoon: "Now we see dimly, but then face to face." Her heart lingered on them, turning them over like smooth stones in her hands. She understood, perhaps for the first time, that to love meant to trust without seeing, to hold faith even in the dim light of unknowing. The stars began to bloom. In the darkening sky, slow, steady, patient, as if each one whispered a single word from heaven: "Endure, endure, endure." Across the city, Diodoro sat outside his shop, the doors closed, the streets quiet. The moonlight stretched across the stones like a path of silver, and for once, the merchant who had once measured everything by worth simply sat and listened. He heard the laughter of young men returning from the harbor, the clop of hooves on the distant road, the sound of a child crying, then soothed by a mother's song. Each sound, though ordinary, carried a strange holiness, because love had changed how he heard the world. He no longer listened to find fault or meaning. He listened simply to be present, the way love listens without judgment, without hurry. He leaned back, looked at the sky, and whispered, "To love is to rest, even while the world moves on." The door creaked open behind him. A young woman, a widow named Irene, stepped into the light. She smiled softly. You still watch the sky every night?" Diodoros nodded. "It's my teacher," he said quietly. "It reminds me to wait." She sat beside him. "Wait for what?" He smiled faintly. "For nothing, perhaps, and for everything. For peace to become habit. For love to finish its work." They sat together in silence. Two souls, worn by the world, yet somehow made gentle by it. The wind passed between them, not separating, but joining. Elsewhere, Lydia sat in her room, the parchment of Paul's letter spread once more across the table. The edges had begun to curl from many readings, and the ink had faded in places, but the words remained strong, like the bones of a hymn. She traced one line slowly with her finger: "Love never fails." The world outside might crumble, she thought. Empires might fall, memories might fade, but these words would outlast all of it. Not because they were written by Paul, but because they were written first by God, upon the heart of creation itself. She thought of the believers scattered across the city, each living the letter now instead of reading it. Each carrying a part of it into the world like small lanterns pushing back the dark. She whispered softly into the stillness, "Perhaps this is how Scripture continues, not only in ink, but in lives transformed." At that same moment, Thais was putting her daughter to bed. The little girl turned sleepily toward her mother and said, "Mama, tell me again about love." Thais smiled and brushed the hair from her forehead. "Love is what makes the stars shine, and the rivers keep flowing. It's what wakes with us in the morning, and follows us to sleep at night." The child's eyes grew heavy. "Does love sleep too?" Thais kissed her cheek. "No, little one, love never sleeps. It keeps watch." She whispered a prayer as her daughter drifted away into dreams. "Lord, let your love be the light that guards her even when my eyes close." Outside, the wind moved through the city like breath through a living body, gentle, constant, unseen. It passed through courtyards, over rooftops, down empty streets, and every soul who had received the letter that week felt it. Not as a chill, but as comfort. The spirit of love had begun its quiet work, mending wounds, softening anger, planting seeds of peace. And somewhere far away, beyond Corinth, beyond the reach of time, Paul himself, weary, aged, perhaps writing another letter by candlelight, lifted his face toward heaven and whispered the same words that now lived in their hearts. Faith, hope, love, but the greatest of these is love. He smiled faintly, feeling, though he could not see, that the letter had taken root. That somewhere, in a small city by the sea, love had found a home. The night deepened. The lamps burned low. The sea breathed softly against the shore. And over Corinth, unseen but certain, the eternal love of God stretched its hands across the city, over the weary, the hopeful, the broken, and the healed, whispering what heaven has always known. Love does not fade, it fulfills. Love does not end, it transforms. Love does not sleep, it keeps watch. The city rested in that truth, every rooftop, every heart, every breath held gently in the hands of divine love that never fails. The night passed slowly, and the first light of morning returned to Corinth, soft, golden, and tender as mercy itself. The streets stirred once more, the city awakening beneath the same sky that had watched its quiet transformation. But now, in the hearts of those who had heard Paul's words, life had changed in ways too subtle for the world to measure. Thais rose early, her body still heavy with sleep, but her spirit light. She stepped outside into the hush before dawn and felt the air cool against her skin. The sky was not yet bright, only brushed with faint silver along the horizon. She could hear the sea distantly breathing beyond the hills, the sound steady and eternal. She closed her eyes and prayed in silence. Not for blessing, not for wealth, not even for safety. Only for one thing, that her heart would remain open. "Lord," she whispered, "teach me to love when it is simple, and even more when it is not." She stood there for a long time, breathing in the stillness. Then, faintly, she heard the sound of footsteps. Turning, she saw her neighbor approaching, the same woman who once had avoided her eyes, who now walked with gentle boldness, carrying a small clay cup. "Thais," the woman said softly, "I thought you might need warm milk this morning." Thais smiled, her voice tender. "And I thought of bringing you bread." They both laughed, a quiet, shared laughter, like the echo of peace. They exchanged their gifts and stood together, watching the light grow over the hills. In that small moment, there were no apologies left to speak, no history to remember. Forgiveness had finished its work. Love had erased the distance that pride once built. Meanwhile, near the market square, Diodoros opened his shop doors. The morning light spilled inside, touching the bolts of cloth like water over stone. He stood there for a moment before beginning his work, his eyes drawn to the harbor through the narrow street. Ships rocked gently against the tide, and the sound of sailors' laughter drifted through the air. He thought about Paul's letter again. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. He whispered the words slowly, each one falling from his lips like a vow. Bears, believes, hopes, endures. He looked down at his hands, hands that once clenched too tightly around the weight of the world, and saw now how they had changed. They had learned to release, to trust, to bless. A small boy appeared at the doorway, the same one who had once received the gift of cloth for his sick mother. He held a tiny loaf of bread wrapped in linen. "My mother asked me to give you this," he said shyly. "She made it for you." Diodoros took the bread carefully, his eyes warming. "Tell her," he said softly, "that this is the finest gift I've ever received." The boy grinned and ran off, and Diodoros watched him go, the loaf still warm in his hands, the scent of love lingering in the air. Across the city, Lydia gathered with a few women at her loom. They wove together as they had every week, threads crossing in steady rhythm. But something was different now. Their work had become worship. Each pass of the shuttle, each tightening of thread, felt like a prayer offered without words. One of the younger women, new to faith, looked up and asked, "How do we know when we've truly learned love?" Lydia smiled softly, her fingers pausing mid-motion. "When you stop trying to measure it," she said. "Love is not a lesson to master. It is the life that begins when you let go of trying." The girl nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. "Then perhaps I have just begun." Lydia smiled again. "Then you are further than most." Outside, the streets were busy once more, voices rising, carts rolling, the rhythm of a city alive. But for those whose hearts had been touched by the letter, the noise no longer drowned peace. It moved through them instead, like wind through trees. By evening, they gathered again by the river bank. The light of sunset touched the water, turning it gold, then rose, then deep blue as the sun slipped beneath the horizon. The elder sat among them, his voice softer now, frail, yet filled with warmth. "My children," he said, "I have seen many things in my years. Temples crumble, rulers rise and fall, cities change their names. But love," he paused, his breath shallow, his eyes bright with tears. "Love remains. It is not a moment, but a foundation. The stone that even time cannot crack." He looked toward the river, where the current glowed faintly beneath the fading light. "When I first heard Paul speak of this love," he continued, "I did not understand. I thought it meant gentleness alone. But now I see, love is not weakness. It is strength that chooses peace when anger could win. It is power that kneels. It is truth that forgives." The wind moved through the reeds like a whisper from heaven. Thais reached for her daughter's hand. Diodoros bowed his head. Lydia closed her eyes, tears glimmering on her cheeks. The elder smiled faintly. "And when I am gone, you will remember this. The letter may fade, but love will not. For it is written not on parchment, but on hearts." He raised his hand slowly toward the gathering dusk. "Faith, hope, love," he whispered, "and the greatest of these is love." The river's murmur answered him, a sound like eternal assent. The sun dipped low, and the stars returned, quiet witnesses to the truth that has never ceased to be true. Love, steady as light, soft as mercy, strong as God himself, moved through Corinth once more. It lingered on every breeze, in every home, in every breath of those who had learned its way. And as night deepened, heaven looked upon the city with tender eyes, and smiled. The night descended upon Corinth like a slow prayer. The stars shimmered above the rooftops, each one a quiet ember in the dark. The sea whispered beyond the hills, and the streets that had once echoed with noise now breathed with peace. For somewhere in the heart of the city, love had taken root, quietly, patiently, eternally. In Lydia's courtyard, the small gathering lingered long after the elder's final words. They did not speak much. There was no sermon left to preach, no question left unanswered. Only presence, the soft knowing that comes when hearts have finally understood. Thais sat with her daughter asleep in her lap. The child's head rested against her arm, her curls damp with the cool of night. Thais traced small circles across her back, feeling the rhythm of her breathing, slow, even, steady, and she thought, this too is love. The quiet giving, the patient holding, the warmth that asks for nothing in return. Across from her, Diodoros sat beside the elder, a small flame from the nearby lamp flickering between them. The merchant's hands were rough from years of labor, yet when he placed them over the elder's, thin, worn, trembling, his touch was as gentle as water. "You have given us something the world could not," Diodoros said softly. The elder smiled faintly. "Not I," he whispered. "Only the word that became flesh, and taught us to see one another as God sees." Diodoros nodded, his eyes glistening. Still, You reminded us to listen for that word within our own hearts." The elder's voice wavered with a laugh that was almost a sigh. "Then my work is done." Silence stretched between them again, but it was the kind of silence that heals. The lamp's light wavered, painting gold along the edges of their faces, and in that light, the distance between teacher and student faded. There were only two souls, bound by love's quiet strength. Near the doorway, Lydia watched them with a smile that trembled at the edges. She had seen this before, the sacred peace that comes when a heart nears completion. The elder's face, though lined with years, glowed with a serenity that could not belong to this world alone. She walked closer, knelt beside him, and said gently, "Rest, Father. We will keep the words alive." He turned to her, his eyes soft and full of light. "Not the words, child," he murmured. "Keep the love alive. The words will fade if they are not lived." Lydia bowed her head. "Then we will live them," she whispered. The elder's hand trembled slightly as he reached to bless them. "Then love will outlast even this city," he said. "It will rise in every act of kindness, in every quiet forgiveness, in every heart that chooses mercy when pride demands more." His eyes closed then, not in weakness, but in prayer. "Let them love one another," he whispered, "as you have loved us." The wind stirred through the olive branches overhead, scattering small petals across the ground like blessings falling from heaven. The night air grew cool. Someone covered the elder with a cloak. The group sat in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the river nearby, its eternal flow a hymn too deep for words. Time passed gently, measured not in minutes, but in breaths. And when at last the elder opened his eyes again, he looked at each of them, Lydia, Diodoros, Thais, and the sleeping child, and smiled. "You see," he whispered, "love has no ending." He leaned back, his gaze lifting toward the stars. "Even when I go," he said softly, "love remains. It will pass from hand to hand, heart to heart, voice to voice, until every soul knows the truth we have found." No one answered. No one needed to. The truth was too sacred for reply. The lamp flickered lower, its light dimming to a soft amber glow. One by one, they rose to leave, each pressing the elder's hand in quiet farewell. Thais lingered last, her daughter still asleep in her arms. She looked at him and said gently, "We will not forget." He smiled faintly. "There is nothing to remember, child," he whispered. "Only something to become." She bowed her head, her tears silent, her heart full. When they stepped into the street, the night embraced them like a promise. The city was quiet now, no laughter, no noise, only the sound of the sea and the wind in the trees. The moon hung high, pure and steady, and in its light, the cobblestones gleamed as though washed in silver. Diodoros walked beside Lydia. Neither spoke. They did not need to. The presence of love filled the air around them, the kind of love that could not be explained, only lived. As they reached the corner where the streets divided, Lydia paused and looked back toward her home. The lamp within still glowed faintly. She whispered, "He is near the end." Diodoros nodded. "No," he said quietly. "He is near the beginning." They parted then, she toward her courtyard, he toward the harbor, each carrying within them a piece of the same eternal flame. That night, as the elder drifted into rest, a peace unlike any other filled the small room. His lips moved once more, though no sound escaped, only a breath that seemed to carry the whole of his faith in a single word. Love. And as his eyes closed for the final time, it was as though the world itself paused to listen. The lamp burned steady beside him. The olive tree rustled softly outside. And somewhere in the unseen distance, a choir of angels whispered what his heart already knew, that love had not ended. It had only returned to its source. In the hours that followed, the believers did not mourn with despair. They sat together beneath the starlit sky, hands joined, hearts steady. They spoke not of death, but of love's endurance, how even now, it lived among them, within them, around them. The city of Corinth slept. But heaven was awake. And between the stars and the sea, the truth moved like wind through the soul of the world. Love never fails. It cannot die. It cannot be lost. It only changes form, from touch, to memory, to light. And so the night deepened, peaceful, holy, eternal. The night stretched long and gentle over Corinth, and though sorrow touched the hearts of those who loved the elder, it was not the sharp sorrow of despair, but the tender ache of gratitude, the kind that humbles the soul and lifts the eyes toward heaven at once. Lydia's courtyard was lit with small lamps that glowed like golden stars against the dark. The believers gathered there once more, quiet, reverent, still. No one spoke loudly. Even their steps upon the stone floor sounded softer that night, as though the earth itself had learned to move with care. The elder's cloak rested upon the bench where he had sat for so many evenings. The parchment of Paul's letter lay open beside it, its pages trembling in the breeze. Lydia stood near the table, her hands folded, her eyes reflecting both light and tears. She did not call the gathering to order, nor did she open with prayer. The silence itself had become prayer enough. The air was heavy with presence, not absence. For though the elder's chair was empty, his peace still filled the courtyard like incense rising after the flame has gone out. Thais arrived last, her daughter's small hand in hers. The child looked around the circle and whispered softly, "Where is he?" Thais knelt beside her, her voice tender as the dusk. "He has gone to see love face to face." The child frowned slightly. "But we can't see him anymore." Thais smiled faintly. "We can, just not with our eyes. When you are kind, when you forgive, when you love someone who is hard to love, you will see him there." The little girl nodded slowly, as if the words themselves carried comfort she did not yet fully understand. She nestled against her mother's side and closed her eyes. Across the courtyard, Diodoros lifted his head. "He told us that love has no ending," he said softly. "And I think now, I begin to believe him." Lydia looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. "How could it end? It is the breath of God himself." The parchment rustled slightly in the wind, and Lydia reached to still it. Her hand brushed across the final lines, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. She traced them with her fingertip, and it felt to her not like ink upon paper, but like truth carved into eternity. She turned toward the others. "We will not read tonight," she said quietly. "We will live what has already been spoken." They nodded, some weeping softly, some smiling through tears. Diodoros rose slowly and went to the small table near the olive tree. There, he poured wine into a single cup and lifted it high beneath the stars. "To the elder," he said. "To the man who taught us not only to speak of love, but to become it." They each took a sip, passing the cup from hand to hand, until every voice had whispered the same blessing, "To love." When the cup returned to the table, Lydia looked upward and said, "Let us remember what he told us, that love is not a word we keep, but a life we give away." A warm wind swept through the courtyard then, moving through the olive branches, stirring the lamps so their light danced across every face. For a moment, the shadows seemed to shimmer, and in that glow, they felt something unseen move among them. Not the ghost of loss, but the spirit of love itself, alive, near, eternal. Thais closed her eyes and let the wind brush against her cheek. It felt like a touch, like the elder's hand resting there once more in blessing. "He is home," she whispered. The believers lingered long into the night. They sang softly, not songs of mourning, but hymns of peace. The melody wove through the air like silk, rising and falling with the rhythm of their hearts. And above them, the stars shone brighter than before, as if heaven itself leaned closer to listen. When the singing faded, Lydia spoke one final time. "He told us that love will outlast this city. I believe it. Long after our names are forgotten, love will still live here, in the stones of these walls, in the waters of this river, in every act of mercy done beneath this sky." Diodoros nodded. "Then we must be its keepers." "And its witnesses," Lydia added. Thais looked down at her daughter and whispered, "And its teachers." The child smiled faintly in her sleep, as though she had heard. They stayed there until the lamps burned low and the first hint of dawn touched the edges of the sky. One by one, they departed, their steps light, their hearts steady. No one feared the coming day, for love had already walked before them. When the last of them had gone, Lydia remained alone. She gathered the parchment carefully and held it against her chest. "He said love would not end," she whispered. "Then this is not the end." She placed the letter upon the elder's cloak, folded both, and set them beside the olive tree. The wind moved softly through the leaves, a final benediction. And as she looked up, she saw the sky blush with the first light of morning. The stars faded one by one, yet the peace they had kindled remained. The elder's words echoed quietly in her mind, "When I am gone, love will remain." She smiled, her tears warm upon her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered, "it remains." And as the sun rose over Corinth, spilling gold across the rooftops, love moved once more through the city, unseen but alive, in every breath, every act of kindness, every quiet forgiveness. The letter had ended. The teaching had ended. But love had just begun. The morning light spread gently across Corinth, soft as linen, pure as peace. The sky was washed in gold and silver, and the sea beyond the harbor shimmered like glass beneath the rising sun. The city awoke slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the stillness that love had left behind. Lydia's courtyard was quiet now, the cloak folded neatly beside the olive tree, the parchment resting upon it. A few petals had fallen in the night, their white edges faintly glowing in the dawn. Lydia knelt before them, her hands still, her eyes full of calm. She did not weep this morning. Her tears had already been sown into something deeper, a quiet joy that did not come from understanding, but from trust. She whispered softly, "Thank you, Lord, for love that endures even after goodbye." The air around her was cool, touched with salt from the sea. It moved gently through the courtyard, stirring the edges of the parchment as if unseen hands were turning its pages once more. Lydia smiled faintly and said, "Yes, I know, the story goes on." In another part of the city, Thais rose with the sun. Her daughter was still sleeping, her curls tangled against the pillow, her face serene in the light. Thais stood for a while watching her, marveling at the innocence that rested so easily where faith had not yet learned to doubt. She thought of the elder's final words, "There is nothing to remember, only something to become." She stepped quietly into the courtyard and poured water into a basin, washing her hands, her face, her heart. "Let me become it, Lord," she prayed softly. "Let me become love in every small thing I do today." Her prayer was not grand. It did not echo or rise like incense. But heaven heard it nonetheless, as heaven always does when love is prayed in silence. She spent the morning as she always did, sweeping the floor, baking bread, mending clothes. Yet every movement felt sacred now, every task like an offering laid upon invisible altars. She had learned that love was not found in moments of greatness, but in the steady giving of ordinary days. When she went to the market, she saw faces differently. The same man who once shouted unfair prices now looked tired, burdened. She greeted him with kindness instead of suspicion. The woman who had once spoken ill of her she met with a smile. The beggar at the corner she approached not with pity, but with companionship, kneeling beside him, sharing half her bread. No one in the market noticed the holiness that walked among them. But heaven noticed. Farther along the street, Diodoros opened his stall for the day. He stood for a long while at the doorway, watching the sunlight spill across the harbor. The sails of the ships gleamed white against the blue, hundreds of them, rising and falling gently with the tide. He thought again of the elder's words, "Love is the stone that even time cannot crack." He whispered them aloud, his voice steady. "Then let me be built upon it." A sailor stopped by his stall to buy cloth. His hands were rough, his voice loud, his manner impatient. But Diodoros listened quietly, measuring the fabric with care, never rushing, never answering sharpness with sharpness. When he handed over the cloth, he added an extra length, folded neatly, without charge. The sailor blinked, confused. "You've given me too much," he said. Diodoros smiled. "No," he answered softly. "I've given you what love gives, more than enough." The sailor stared for a moment, unsure what to say, then nodded once, muttering a quiet thanks before walking away. Diodoros watched him go and felt something inside him ease, like a knot untied. By midday, the air was warm and full of life. The people of Corinth went about their work, trading, building, baking, laughing. But unseen among them, love moved still, through small hands passing bread, through kind words spoken over broken ones, through silent prayers whispered while washing away dust. And as the day wore on, Lydia left her courtyard and walked to the river. The water glittered under the sun, rippling softly against the stones. She sat at the edge and looked at her reflection. It trembled slightly, caught in the current, yet she could still recognize herself. "So this is how we see now," she murmured. "Dimly, but still enough to know we are loved." She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun upon her face. The sounds of the world faded, the chatter of birds, the rhythm of footsteps, the distant hum of the city, until only the pulse of her heart remained, beating slow and steady with the rhythm of creation. And within that rhythm, she heard again the truth that had carried them all through loss, through joy, through every moment between: love never fails. The river glistened as if nodding in agreement. When she rose to leave, she gathered a smooth stone from the river's edge and placed it in her palm. It was cool and solid, a reminder of what endures when everything else fades. She held it close to her heart and whispered, "Let my heart be as steadfast as this." That evening, as the sun set again over the hills, painting the sky with fire and peace, the city of Corinth rested once more beneath the gaze of God. Lamps flickered in windows. Laughter drifted through doorways. The sea breathed softly beyond the walls. And in that harmony of sound and silence, love, divine, unending, unseen, lingered in every corner. It whispered through the trees, it shimmered in the waters, it breathed through the hearts that had learned its way. And though the elder's voice was gone, his teaching lived on, not in parchment, not in ink, but in the small mercies that now filled the streets of Corinth. Love had become their language, their faith, their way. The sky over Corinth turned from gold to violet as evening descended once more. The city settled into its rhythm of closing, merchants drawing down their stalls, families lighting lamps, the air filling with the fragrance of oil and bread. The world carried on as it always had, yet for those whose hearts had been touched by the letter, life no longer felt the same. Love had altered the air itself, invisible, but everywhere. Lydia walked slowly through the narrow streets, her shawl drawn lightly around her shoulders. She had just come from the river, where she had watched the sunlight dissolve into water until there was no line between earth and sky. Each reflection had reminded her of the truth she now lived by, that heaven was nearer than she had ever believed, and love was the bridge between them. As she passed the baker's stall, she paused to help gather a tray that had slipped from a young apprentice's hands. Loaves scattered onto the ground, and the boy looked ready to cry. "Do not worry," she said gently, kneeling to help him. "Bread can be baked again, but peace, once lost, takes longer to rise." The boy blinked, half understanding, but smiled anyway. When she left, he watched her go with a softness in his eyes that would stay long after she was gone. Elsewhere, Diodoros stood at the harbor, his hands resting on the worn wood of the pier. Ships creaked in their moorings, the ropes swaying like slow breathing. He watched a fisherman mend his net nearby, threading and tying with patient skill. "That knot," Diodoros said quietly, "it reminds me of love." The fisherman looked up, puzzled. "Of love?" Diodoros nodded. "It holds things together, and it grows stronger when it bears weight." The man laughed softly, shaking his head, but there was gratitude in his smile. Then may all my knots hold, friend. They will, Diodoros replied, if they are tied with care. The wind shifted, cool, carrying the scent of the open sea, and Diodoros closed his eyes. He thought again of the elder's blessing, of the cloak folded by the olive tree, of the words that refused to fade. He whispered to himself, faith remains, hope remains, and love remains most of all. The sound of the waves answered him like a quiet amen. In her small home at the edge of the city, Thais sat beside her daughter, who was braiding reeds into a small crown. The girl's fingers moved with focus, her tongue pressed against her lip. When she finished, she held it up proudly. Look, Mama, a crown for the elder. For when we see him again. Thais smiled, tears glimmering in her eyes. He already wears one, my love. But we'll keep this here, to remind us how love never ends. The child placed the crown upon the windowsill, where the light of the setting sun touched it. The reeds glowed golden for a moment before settling into shadow. Do you think he can see us? The girl asked. Thais brushed her daughter's hair. Yes, not with eyes like ours, but with the same love that sees everything. The girl smiled and leaned against her mother. Then love really does see forever. Yes, Thais whispered. Forever and always. That night, the believers gathered again, not out of habit, but out of need, a need to be together, to let the warmth of shared presence remind them that love was alive among them still. They met in Lydia's courtyard, where the olive branches whispered under the moon. The cloak and the parchment remained where they had been left, a silent witness to all that had changed. No one spoke at first. The quiet between them was deep, almost sacred. Then Lydia began to hum a melody, an old hymn, one they had sung before the letter had come. Others joined softly, their voices weaving through the night air like threads of gold through dark fabric. The words were simple. Love is the light that never fades. Love is the flame no wind can still. Love is the gift that fear cannot take. Love is the will of God fulfilled. Their song rose and fell like the tide. Some closed their eyes, others lifted their faces toward the stars. And as the last note faded, it left behind a silence so full that it seemed heaven itself was listening. Lydia looked around at them all and said softly, "This is what remains, not what we built, not what we owned, but what we gave in love." Diodoros nodded. "Even now, I can feel it in the air." Thais smiled, holding her daughter close. Love has learned the way home. They stayed long after the lamps had burned low. The moonlight traced their faces, and for a moment it seemed as though every soul in that small courtyard was joined to something vast and eternal. One heartbeat, one light, one endless love moving quietly through all things. When they finally parted, no one said farewell. There were no goodbyes left to speak. For in love, there are none. There is only the next beginning. The night wrapped the city in silver and peace. The sea breathed. The stars glowed. And the truth, the one truth that had crossed years and oceans to reach them, lingered still, whispering through the wind. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, and beyond all endings, love remains. The stars stretched wide over Corinth at night, vast and silent, as though the heavens themselves were holding their breath in reverence. The air was cool, and the city slept beneath a sky so clear it seemed one could see eternity in its depths. In Lydia's courtyard, the lamps had all been extinguished, yet their fragrance still lingered, olive oil and faint smoke, the scent of gatherings that had filled those walls with prayer and peace. The olive tree stood motionless in the moonlight, its leaves glimmering faintly with silver edges, its roots deep in the earth like faith that does not waver. The cloak and the parchment still lay folded upon the bench, untouched. The night wind stirred them once, softly, and then grew still again. For the story of Paul's words had now passed beyond the written line. It had become life itself. Thais dreamed lightly beside her daughter, her mind filled with scenes of sunlight on water, of the elder's gentle voice, of laughter and forgiveness. She dreamed that love moved through the city like breath, invisible but constant, filling every empty space with warmth. And perhaps it did. For that same hour, Diodoros stood upon the high ridge near the harbor, his cloak wrapped tight against the wind. Below him, the sea shimmered faintly beneath the moon, the ships bobbing gently in their sleep. He looked toward the horizon, where water and sky met in endless embrace, and whispered, "It never ends." He closed his eyes and felt the truth of it settle inside him. Love was not a lesson learned and finished. It was a pulse, eternal, unbroken, the heartbeat of God echoing through the souls of those who believed. In the stillness, he spoke softly to the night. "You have carried us, Lord, through fear, through pride, through pain, and still you teach us to love. Not once, not briefly, but again and again." The wind brushed his face like an unseen hand. It smelled of salt and dawn and promise. He turned to leave and saw, at the edge of the path, a small flower blooming from a crack in the stone, fragile, unexpected, alive. He knelt beside it and smiled. "Even here," he whispered, "love finds a way." Far across the city, Lydia could not sleep. She sat by her window, watching the moon trace its slow path above the rooftops. The world was quiet but full, not empty silence, but living stillness. The kind that comes after great storms, when the heart at last understands peace. She opened her hands upon her lap and prayed without words. Not for strength, not for guidance, only for gratitude, that she had lived long enough to see how love could change even the hardest hearts. She thought of the first days of the church in Corinth, how proud they had been, how divided, how certain of their own ways. And she thought of them now, still imperfect, still learning, but bound by something far greater than knowledge or speech. It had not come quickly. It had come through years of forgiveness, of patience, of choosing gentleness when pride demanded fire. And through it all, love had endured, slow, steady, unstoppable. She smiled faintly. "So this," she whispered, "is what Paul meant when he said love never fails." The words felt different now. They were no longer a hope. They were a certainty. Outside her window, the olive tree's branches swayed. Its leaves caught the moonlight, and Lydia thought of all who had sat beneath it. The elder, Thais and her child, Diodoros, the widows, the travelers, the broken and the mended. Their lives had intertwined like the tree's roots, unseen, but strong. She whispered one last prayer before resting her head against the window frame. Lord, let the roots of love go deep enough that no storm can reach them. And in the distance, the faint murmur of the sea answered her prayer with its endless rhythm. As the night moved toward dawn, a hush of holiness covered the city. It was as if heaven itself leaned close, breathing peace over every sleeping soul. The markets were quiet, the courtyards empty. Yet something unseen filled the streets, something alive and radiant. It moved through the alleyways, through open windows, through dreams. It touched the weary and the joyful alike. It was not voice, not wind, not light, but all of them together. Love. Love in its truest form, not sentiment, not word, but being. The same love that spoke the stars into existence. The same love that walked the hills of Galilee and broke bread in humble rooms. The same love that had found its way, through ink and faith, to this city by the sea. It rested upon Corinth that night like a benediction that would never end. And when the first hint of morning brushed the sky, pale and new, the city awoke once more beneath the gaze of God, unaware that eternity had passed among them while they slept. The letter had been written. The elder had spoken. The lamps had burned low. But love, the love that bears, believes, hopes, and endures, still lived. It flowed in silence through every heart that had learned its rhythm. And heaven, watching, whispered over the waking world, "It is enough." The morning came softly once more over Corinth, slow and golden, as if the sun itself hesitated to disturb the peace that lingered in the air. The sea shimmered beyond the city's walls, the wind whispered through the olive branches, and the faint aroma of baking bread and oil drifted through the waking streets. It was an ordinary morning, and yet it was not ordinary at all. For within that quiet light, love still moved unseen, steady, eternal, alive. Lydia walked through her courtyard, her bare feet brushing against the cool stone. The cloak still rested upon the bench, folded neatly, the parchment tucked beneath it. She did not move them. They had become part of the place now, symbols of all that had been given and received. She poured water into a small clay basin and knelt beside the olive tree, sprinkling its roots with care. "Grow deep," she whispered softly. "Grow where storms cannot reach." As she worked, a familiar voice called from the gate. "Lydia." She turned and saw Diodoro standing there, his face lit by the morning sun. He held in his hand a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "I've brought something," he said as he entered. "From the harbor." He unwrapped the cloth carefully, revealing a smooth piece of driftwood, bleached pale by sea and time. It was carved roughly, a cross, simple and unpolished, shaped by the hand of one who worked not for beauty but for devotion. "I found it caught in a fisherman's net," Diodoro said quietly. He was going to throw it back, but I thought, perhaps it belongs here. Lydia smiled, her eyes tender. "Yes," she said softly. "Here, among the living." Together they placed it by the olive tree, a symbol beside a symbol, and for a long while they said nothing. The silence between them was full, like music too sacred to speak aloud. When at last Lydia spoke, her voice trembled slightly. "Do you think," she asked, "that love truly changes the world?" Diodoros looked toward the sea, where light danced like scattered fire. "It already has," he said. "Look at us. Once strangers, now family. Once afraid, now free." He turned to her. "That is how love conquers, not by power, but by peace." Lydia nodded slowly, her gaze falling upon the small cross at her feet. "Then this city is not the same," she whispered. "And neither are we." As they spoke, Thais appeared at the gate with her daughter beside her. The little girl carried a small basket filled with figs and bread. "We brought breakfast," Thais said with a smile. They sat together beneath the olive tree, sharing the meal. The child giggled as she fed crumbs to a sparrow that hopped near her feet. The sound of her laughter rose through the courtyard like a hymn, light and clear. Lydia watched her and thought of Paul's words. "When I was a child, I spoke as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things." And yet, perhaps love was the one thing never meant to be put away. For the laughter of a child was not folly, but faith, faith that joy was still possible, even in a weary world. As they ate, Diodoros told them stories from the harbor, of sailors who spoke of faraway lands, of storms survived, of families waiting at distant shores. Each story ended the same way, with someone returning home. When he finished, Thais said softly, "It seems love always leads us home." Lydia smiled. "Even when we do not know the road." The conversation faded into stillness then. The sunlight shifted through the leaves, painting golden patterns upon the ground. The breeze moved gently through the courtyard, carrying the faint scent of figs and salt. The little girl leaned against her mother and asked, "Mama, will we see the elder again someday?" Thais brushed a curl from her daughter's face and answered, "Yes, child, not here, but in the place where love began, and where it never ends." The girl smiled sleepily and whispered, "Then we'll bring him bread too." They all laughed softly, and even Lydia's heart, full and tender, felt the joy of that simple promise. When the meal was finished, they sat together in silence, listening to the city breathe. Somewhere beyond the walls, a bell tolled from the marketplace, its sound carried by the wind. The waves answered faintly in return, as though the sea itself were joining their prayer. And in that perfect stillness, Lydia looked at her friends and said, "Perhaps love's greatest miracle is not what it gives us, but what it leaves behind." Diodoros nodded. "It leaves peace," he said quietly. Thais added, "It leaves memory." And the little girl, half asleep in her mother's arms, whispered, "It leaves light." The words settled like seeds upon the air. None contradicted the other. All were true. The sun climbed higher, and the courtyard filled with brightness. The cross cast a small shadow upon the stones, shaped like an open heart. The olive branches swayed overhead. And beneath them, love continued to live, in bread, in laughter, in silence, in the spaces between words. Corinth breathed. Heaven watched. The world turned. And still, love remained. The evening came like a sigh of peace over Corinth, slow and radiant, the kind of twilight that seems to whisper a benediction upon everything it touches. The sun sank behind the hills in a blaze of gold, its final light washing the rooftops in warmth before yielding to the soft embrace of night. The sea beyond the city breathed steadily, its rhythm calm and eternal. Lamps flickered to life one by one, scattered stars upon the earth mirroring those about to bloom in the heavens above. And through it all, love lingered, unseen, but everywhere, moving like wind through olive branches, like light upon still water. Lydia sat quietly in her courtyard, her hands folded upon her lap. The small cross Diodoros had brought rested near the olive tree, catching the last light of the sun. The parchment remained folded beneath the elder's cloak, a relic now, but still alive in its truth. She breathed deeply and whispered into the dusk, "We have kept the words, Lord, but more than that, we have kept the love." Thais entered softly through the gate, her daughter beside her. The child carried a small lantern, its glow trembling against the deepening shadows. Diodoros followed behind them, his steps slow but steady. They gathered around the olive tree, as they always did, though there was no reading tonight, no sermon, no speech. Only stillness. Only gratitude. The courtyard filled with the quiet hum of evening, a dove cooing from the rooftop, the faint rustle of branches, the whisper of wind through linen. The peace was deep, vast, holy. Lydia looked around at them and smiled. "When we first read Paul's letter," she said softly, "I thought love was something we needed to learn. But now I see, love was already within us. We only needed to remember." Diodoros nodded. "It took time," he said quietly, "but time was patient, and love waited with it." Thais looked down at her daughter, who had fallen silent, her small eyes reflecting the light of the lantern. "And love taught us how to see," she whispered. "Not with our minds, but with our hearts." They fell quiet again, the moment stretching like eternity itself. The olive tree swayed lightly above them, its leaves shimmering like stars of their own. The light from the lantern painted a golden circle around them, a small island of warmth in the cool night air. Lydia lifted her gaze toward the heavens. "When Paul wrote to us, he said we see now only in part. But tonight," her voice wavered, "tonight, I think I see clearly." The child looked up at her and asked softly, "What do you see?" Lydia smiled, her eyes glistening with tears that did not fall. "I see love, everywhere. In the air we breathe, in the hands we hold, in the faces before me. I see the kingdom of God." Diodoros bowed his head. "And it is here," he said. "Not waiting in the clouds, but here, in every act of kindness, in every choice to forgive, in every heart that believes." Thais closed her eyes, her voice a whisper. "Then we are already home." The wind moved gently through the courtyard, the flame of the lantern flickered, and for a brief, timeless moment, heaven and earth seemed to meet in silence. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. The truth was too simple, too beautiful, to be clothed in words. The stars rose higher, filling the sky like seeds of light sown across eternity. The sea's song deepened, the night folded itself around the city in soft blue peace. Lydia finally spoke again, her tone like prayer. "Faith remains, hope remains, and love remains. But love is the breath that carries both." She reached for Thais' hand. Thais reached for Diodoros's. The child placed a small hand upon them all. A circle of warmth. A circle of light. A circle unbroken. The olive leaves above them rustled as if in response, their shadows dancing across the walls. And in that simple joining of hands, in the stillness, the breath, the shared peace, they understood at last what Paul had meant. Love never fails. Not in joy. Not in sorrow. Not in life. Not in death. It endures, because it is of God. And God is love. The night deepened, but it did not grow darker, for love had made the darkness gentle. The lantern flame burned low, its light steady to the end. And as sleep began to settle over the city, Lydia whispered the final words of the letter aloud, her voice barely more than breath. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. The wind carried her voice softly into the stars. And the city rested. And heaven listened. And love, eternal, unending, unbroken, watched over them all.